Hi again. Welcome back. This will be our last little section of PowerPoints for Chapter 7. And we're continuing our discussion about food production, agriculture, animals for food, genetic modification. And so this last segment is going to focus on raising animals for food. We talked about genetic modification in the last little clip, and your current event articles are about the genetically modified salmon. And so just so you are aware, the genetically modified salmon we used recombinant DNA technology to combine genes from 3 different species of fish. The Atlantic salmon, the coho salmon, and a pout, which is sort of an eel-like fish. The growth hormone, or the growth switch, if you will, that produces growth hormone, which makes the fish grow. They've substituted a different growth hormone gene. And then the third fish, this sort of an eel-like fish called a pout, they harvested the gene that keeps the growth switch, the growth hormone switch, on all of the time. Most animals don't grow all of the time, right? So they get switched on, the growth hormones produced, and they grow and they make new cells and they get bigger, and then growth pauses for a while. Then they grow and they pause, and they grow and they pause. The gene from the pout allows the growth hormone switch from the second coho to stay on and active all of the time. So it's growing all of the time, pretty much non-stop cell division, which then of course makes the fish grow twice as fast. I think it's twice as fast, but it makes it available to market in about half the time. So when you read the current event articles, there's 2. One that talks about the actual genetic modification process and where in the world it's happening, and also one that talks about a host of lawsuits that are in place, which has prevented that genetically modified salmon from coming to market in the United States. It's already for sale in Canada and is also not labeled. So it's an interesting look at food production. Let's talk about raising animals for food. So again, we're looking at this idea that if human population is continuing to climb and our food production is continuing to climb, how is that possible? What are we doing in order to achieve that? And we are certainly altering our meat production as well. So this graph looks at per capita meat consumption. Do you remember what per capita means? Per person. So per capita, or per person, meat consumption has steadily increased since 1960. And this graph here is kind of showing us with not just decades, but years on the x-axis here, per person global production in kilograms of meat per person per year. And you can see a steady increase in both meat, poultry, pork, and beef, as well as seafood. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the UNFAO, estimates that meat, there's a typo, total meat, I like that better, that total meat consumption will nearly double by 2050. So we are on that trajectory to keep eating more meat and more meat. So let's see how we're doing that. One of the ways in which we've been able to produce more meat for more people is through hormone supplements. Typically, these are more common in the United States and in Canada and less common in Europe. But hormone supplements means that the organism would either grow faster or produce products faster, which again allows us to increase production. Have you ever seen in the market on your milk or your yogurt or cheese this little label, and this says, this milk from cows, or sometimes it'll say this product made from milk, right? Not treated with RBST. The Food and Drug Administration has determined there is no significant difference between milk from RBST treated cows and non-RBST treated cows. RBST is short for recombinant bovine somatotropin, and this is a growth hormone that is, well, has been in the past, was given to cows, which stimulated them to produce more milk than they would have normally produced. So RBST treated cows produced more milk, which of course made more money and upped the production. This label here came about because there was some pushback from the general public about growth hormones in their food. And in fact, there was a boycott. People began boycotting milk that was from cows treated with RBST, or any milk products like yogurt that was produced from milk that came from cows treated with this growth hormone. For the most part, even though the FDA is telling us there's no difference in that, people pushed back against that, and you'll really be hard-pressed to find any milk or milk products from cows treated with RBST. So that growth hormone has pretty much left the market in almost all cases, which is a really great reminder that you vote with your dollar, right? That you are powerful beyond measure when it comes to the economics of what you choose to purchase and what you choose to avoid. Okay, let's talk about antibiotics in the food production industry. So a lot of our meat products cannot be produced without administering antibiotics to those animals. And we'll talk a little bit about growth conditions in a minute. About 40% of the antibiotics produced in the United States are used in livestock operations. They're not used for treating people with bacterial infections. They're given to livestock. They're given to chickens. They're given to pigs, and the antibiotics are given to cows to keep them healthy in their growing conditions. So that produces a whole host of other concerns about the ethics of the environments in which they're raised. Why do they need antibiotics? And most of the time they're giving them prophylactically, which means they're always giving them antibiotics. They don't wait for them to become sick because they pretty much know they're going to get sick. And this, of course, leads to antibiotic resistance because natural selection is working on every single living thing 24/7, and this is no exception. So this little graph here shows us, x-axis shows us the year and the percent of antibiotic resistance that we see. And I mean, what an exponential J curve we have right there, right? And so again, this graph is not about antibiotic use, but the graph is about antibiotic resistance, that it's gone through the roof. Now keep in mind, this is really important for us as human beings as well, if you like a more anthropocentric viewpoint, and even if you don't eat meat. Because if bacteria become resistant to certain antibiotics, right, then when we need them as human beings, we find that those antibiotics don't work for us anymore either. And so just the huge broadcast use of those is causing problems. But it has allowed us to produce more meat for consumption. So again, we're kind of looking at the ways in which humans have been able to increase our food production. We're focusing on animals in this video for this part of the PowerPoint. And so hormone supplements have worked, and using antibiotics to keep our animals healthy and keep them alive also works. Okay, so over the course of time, we've been seeing an increase in demand for animal products, more meat per capita. And in order to meet this demand, we started needing to manage our livestock populations differently. We needed to grow more, and we needed to do this quicker. And this led to the invention of what we call feedlot agriculture. And the CAFO has come about. And CAFO is an acronym, CAFO, and the acronym stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation. So I want to pause here and make sure that we understand that these feedlots, these CAFOs, are not farms, right? They are feeding operations, and it's really an important distinction to make. So what we've been able to do is to take a piece of land and produce more meat per unit area, say per acre, or let's be more metric, per square kilometer, because we've squeezed more organisms into a smaller space. So these CAFOs, whether they are for chickens or whether they are for pigs or whether they are for cows, are incredibly dense environments. Now these organisms, this is a feeding operation, right? These organisms are fed energy dense food, right? So they're getting a lot of calories and a lot of energy in their food products. So the goal is, of course, that they would grow relatively quickly. So there are some benefits to a feedlot agriculture, to a CAFO. And again, we're focusing on ways in which you've been able to produce more food. Number one, economics. They're efficient. You can grow a boatload of organisms if you squeeze them into a tiny space. And so, ethics aside, economically speaking, it's a benefit. And this has produced artificially cheap meat for the marketplace, for you and I to go into a supermarket and buy meat at a relatively low price. We've increased the amount of meat that we can sell to each person, so per capita consumption has gone up because, again, we're not expanding so much the amount of land that we're using as we are squeezing more individual organisms onto a smaller space when we're thinking about feedlot agriculture or CAFOs. So this makes meat more affordable, which then prompts individuals to perhaps eat it more often. It's hard to deny that when you look at the fast food industry as well, and how cheaply you can get a burger or some chicken product, a chicken sandwich, chicken nuggets. It makes meat enormously inexpensive, and of course that prompts consumers to purchase more, right? That supply and demand is always at play. When things are cheap, we tend to buy more of them. One of the other upsides to this is it does take animals off of rangeland. So cattle that are grazing on public rangeland managed by the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, these are removed from those publicly owned spaces and they're concentrated into another location. There are some downsides, of course, some impacts of feedlots that are perhaps obvious and maybe not so obvious. So one of the big problems is the waste that's created. This shows a feedlot for cattle, and they are living in an incredibly dense environment. They are usually ankle deep in their own feces and in their own waste. And so that waste, all of the urine and the feces, then typically it needs to go someplace. And so it oftentimes percolates down into the soil and pollutes the groundwater. There's a lot of instances where local water sources, individuals that live in those rural communities around those feedlot areas, where their well water is contaminated and local water sources get contaminated by that. So there's some larger scale contamination issues that spread out into the larger environment. Let's talk about the smell, right? Have you ever driven south on I-5, Interstate 5, down to Los Angeles, and you've driven through Coalinga? that's where the cows are. And you know it if you've done it, right? And it smells horrible. We always have to roll up our windows at that point. And the smell, not only, well, this is from the ammonia, right? Of course, from the waste products of the cows and just the sheer dense nature of that environment. And so it creates an odor for that region, for those individuals that live in the area, and alters the environment. These are obviously crowded, dense, dirty conditions. And so for these cattle to survive and not die, the use of antibiotics is necessary. So as I mentioned, these situations, these CAFOs or CAFOs use antibiotics prophylactically, meaning just in case, because animals will get sick and they won't survive living in those conditions. And then if this, of course, leads to an increase in antibiotic resistance. Right? Another impact we need to think about is the ethical concerns that some individuals have regarding the animals' living conditions. That if we are going to raise living organisms for food, do we feel a moral or ethical obligation on any level to give them a decent quality of life? And most individuals would agree that these feedlots are not giving those organisms a good quality of life before they're harvested for to feed humans. So that's a big piece of that conversation. Okay, let's talk about energy. So when we think about raising animals for food, we want to think about how we do it. Are we using hormones that affect human health, like in the case of RBST? Are we using antibiotics, which affect the environment, antibiotic resistance, which can then have a human impact as well? Do we have ethical concerns? Are we creating dense, waste-ridden areas that are affecting water quality in surrounding areas? And then the other thing we want to think about is energy. It takes a ton of energy to produce meat for food. And so this simplified image kind of shows you the amount of food here, feed input, that you would have to use to produce an output of 1 kilogram, there we go, 1 kilogram of the animal product. So beef and cattle are notoriously inefficient for converting food into mass or biomass. So you're going to use 20 kilograms of feed in order to produce 1 kilogram of beef. Pork's a little bit more efficient, energetically speaking, 7.3 kilograms to give you that same kilogram of pork product. Eggs and chicken are much better. You can see they require less feed in order to produce the same kilogram of animal protein. So our food choices then become energy choices. And this is a really great moment to remind ourselves about the second law of thermodynamics, right? You thought you weren't going to see this again, right? The second law of thermodynamics, of course, tells us that entropy increases as energy is transformed or changes form from a food product, say grass that the cow is eating, into the biomass, the biological mass of the animal product itself. All right, and so we know that we only get about 10% of that usable energy, and so these conversions are showing us that certain animal food choices are more efficient in the energetic sphere than others. Okay, let's talk about land, and let's talk about water required to produce animal products for food. So beef is always the biggest loser. Sorry, beef lovers, it is. The land required to produce 1 kilogram of animal protein. What type of meat requires the most land to produce? Well, here the cows are the biggest losers, right? It takes 245 square meters of physical space to produce 1 kilogram of beef protein, as compared to, say, 14 square meters of physical space to produce the same kilogram of animal protein from a chicken, right? Producing animals for food requires that we think not only about energy, but about land and about water. And so you're better off eating chicken or chicken products like an egg for animal protein when it comes to environmental use, right? With regard to land, for sure. Okay, let's talk about water. What type of meat requires the most water to produce? Well, biggest loser is always beef. 750 kilograms of water to produce that same kilogram of animal product of beef. And of course, chickens and chicken products are going to be your most efficient choice for land, for water, and for energy. Now, when we talk about climate change, we're also going to talk about methane production. And cows produce methane as part of their digestive process. And methane is a powerful greenhouse gas. And as they release that methane, they burp it. They burp it out as they're eating. They're contributing substantially to climate change. It's not a small amount. So we'll talk a little bit about food, in particular beef choices when we get into our climate discussion. But that's also a big part of our discussion. And lastly, I want to mention aquaculture. Now, this will be part of your third and final ecological footprint assignment, to look at raising seafood as human sustenance. And aquaculture is basically like raising seafood, fish, shellfish, shrimp, oysters, clams, and farming them in the way that we would farm terrestrial animals like pigs and chickens and cows. But we're doing that in the water. And it can be in a large enclosure on land, like a giant fish tank, or it can be in the ocean itself. And this is called aquaculture, not agriculture, but aquaculture. And we are seeing an increase in aquaculture because the wild fish populations and the demand for seafood is increasing, and the populations then are decreasing. So aquaculture is becoming a little bit more commonly used. And there's some pros and cons to that, and we can talk about that in our third ecological footprint assignment. Okay, that's chapter 7. So tried to break it up into 3 little chunks. So in the beginning we talked about food security, food insecurity. We talked about soil and how important it is to maintain healthy soil. We talked about soil erosion and how we can prevent soil erosion. In our second video, we talked about producing food with plants and how we've been able to increase that production over time. We talked about pesticides and herbicides, selective breeding, which is artificial selection, and something very different, which is genetic modification. And we have not been doing that for very long. Artificial selection, long time. Genetic modification, not so long. Let's talk about that, pros and cons of that. And then in the third video clip, this one we just watched, we talked about animals being produced for food and human consumption and how we've been able to increase that in recent years. And then we talked about hormones. We talked about the use of antibiotics and the problems associated with that. We talked about the CAFO, the concentrated animal feeding operation, and the pros and cons of that. And then we kind of touched on aquaculture and our food choices being energy choices and choices that affect water and land use from an ecological perspective, that your food choices matter. Right? Okay, so that's it for chapter 7. We've got some current event articles on salmon, there's a video to watch, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are well, and I will see you soon. Bye.